Lecture 8, The Divided Self and the Process of its Unification. The last lecture was a painful one, dealing as it did with evil as a pervasive element of the world we live in. At the close of it, we were brought into full view of the contrast between the two ways of looking at life, which are characteristic respectively of what we called the healthy-minded, who need to be born only once, and of the sick souls, who must be twice born in order to be happy. The result is two different conceptions of the universe of our experience. In the religion of the once born, the world is a sort of rectilinear or one-storied affair, whose accounts are kept in one denomination, whose parts have just the values which naturally they appear to have, and of course which a simple algebraic sum of pluses and of which a simple algebraic sum of pluses and minuses will give the total worth. Happiness and religious peace consist in living on the plus side of the account. In the religion of the twice born, on the other hand, the world is a double-storied mystery. Peace cannot be reached by the simple addition of pluses and elimination of minuses from life. Natural good is not simply insufficient in amount and transient. There lurks a falsity in its very being. Cancelled as it all is by death, if not by earlier enemies, it gives no final balance, and can never be the thing intended for our lasting worship. It keeps us from our real good, rather, and renunciation and despair of it are our first step in the direction of the truth. There are two lives, the natural and the spiritual, and we must lose the one before we can participate in the other. In their extreme forms of pure naturalism and pure salvationism, the two types are violently contrastive. Though here, as in most other current classifications, the radical extremes are somewhat ideal abstractions, and the concrete human beings whom we oftenest meet are intermediate varieties and mixtures. Practically, however, you all recognize the difference. You understand, for example, the disdain of the Methodist convert for the mere sky-blue, healthy-minded moralist, and you likewise enter into the aversion of the latter to what seems to him the diseased subjectivism of the Methodist, dying to live, as he calls it, and making of paradox and the inversion of natural appearances the essence of God's truth. The psychological basis of the twice-born character seems to be a certain discordancy or heterogeneity in the native temperament of the subject, an incompletely unified moral and intellectual constitution. Homo duplex, writes Alphonse Daudet. The first time that I perceived that I was two was at the death of my brother Henry, when my father cried out so dramatically, "He is dead, he is dead." While my first self wept, my second self thought, how truly given was that cry, how fine would it be at the theater. I was then 14 years old. This horrible duality has often given me matter for reflection. Oh, this terrible second me, always seated whilst the other is on foot, acting, living, suffering, bestirring itself. This second me that I have never been able to intoxicate, to make shed tears or put to sleep, and how it sees into things and how it mocks. Recent works on the psychology of character have had much to say upon this point. Some persons are born with an inner constitution which is harmonious and well balanced from the outset. Their impulses are consistent with one another. Their will follows without trouble the guidance of their intellect. Their passions are not excessive, and their lives are little haunted by regrets. Others are oppositely constituted, and are so in degrees which may vary from something so slight as to result in a merely odd or whimsical inconsistency, to a discordancy of which the consequences may be inconvenient in the extreme. Of the more innocent kinds of heterogeneity, I find a good example in Mrs. Annie Besant's autobiography. Quote, I have ever been the queerest mixture of weakness and strength, and have paid heavily for the weakness. As a child, I used to suffer tortures of shyness, and if my shoelace was untied, would feel shamefacedly that every eye was fixed on the unlucky string. As a girl, I would shrink away from strangers and think myself unwanted and unliked, so that I was full of eager gratitude to anyone who noticed me kindly. As the young mistress of a house, I was afraid of my servants, and would let careless work pass rather than bear the pain of reproving the ill-doer. When I have been lecturing and debating with no lack of spirit on the platform, I have preferred to go without what I wanted at the hotel, rather than to ring and make the waiter fetch it. Combative on the platform in defense of any cause I cared for, I shrink from quarrel or disapproval in the house, and am a coward at heart in private life, while a good fighter in public. How often have I passed unhappy quarters of an hour, screwing up my courage to find fault with some subordinate whom my duty compelled me to reprove, and how often have I jeered myself for a fraud as the dowdy platform combatant, when shrinking from blaming some lad or lass for doing their work badly. An unkind look or word has availed to make me shrink into myself as a snail into its shell, while on the platform opposition makes me speak my best. This amount of inconsistency will only count as amiable weakness, but a stronger degree of heterogeneity may make havoc of the subject's life. There are persons whose existence is little more than a series of zigzags, as now one tendency and now another gets the upper hand. Their spirit wars with their flesh. They wish for incompatibles. Wayward impulses interrupt their most deliberate plans, and their lives are one long drama of repentance and of effort to repair misdemeanors and mistakes. Heterogeneous personality has been explained as the result of inheritance. The traits of character are incompatible, and antagonistic ancestors are supposed to be preserved alongside of each other. This explanation may pass for what it is worth. It certainly needs corroboration. But whatever the cause of heterogeneous personality may be, we find the extreme examples of it in the psychopathic temperament, of which I spoke in my first lecture. All writers about that temperament make the inner heterogeneity prominent in their descriptions. Frequently, indeed, it is only this trait that leads us to ascribe that temperament to a man at all. A degenere superior is simply a man of sensibility in many directions who finds more difficulty than is common in keeping his spiritual house in order and running his furrows straight, because his feelings and impulses are too keen and too discrepant mutually. In the haunting and insistent ideas and the irrational impulses, the morbid scruples, dreads, and inhibitions which beset the psychopathic temperament when it is thoroughly pronounced, we have exquisite examples of heterogeneous personality. Bunyan had an obsession of the words, quote, sell Christ for this, sell him for that, sell him, which would run through his mind 100 times together, until one day, out of breath with retorting, I will not, he impulsively said, let him go if he will, and this loss of the battle kept him in despair for over a year. The lives of saints are full of such blasphemous obsessions, ascribed invariably to the direct agency of Satan. The phenomenon connects itself with the life of the subconscious self, so-called, of which we must ere long speak more directly. Now, in all this, however constituted, but to a degree the greater in proportion as we are intense and sensitive and subject to diversified temptations, and to the greatest possible degree if we are decidedly psychopathic, does the normal evolution of character chiefly consist in the straightening out and unifying of the inner self. The higher and the lower feelings, the useful and the erring impulses, begin by being a comparative chaos within us. They must end by forming a stable system of functions in right subordination. Unhappiness is apt to characterize the period of order-making and struggle. If the individual be of tender conscience and religiously quickened, the unhappiness will take the form of moral remorse and compunction, of feeling inwardly vile and wrong, and of standing in false relations to the author of one's being and appointer of one's spiritual fate. This is the religious melancholy and, quote, conviction of sin that have played so large a part in the history of Protestant Christianity. The man's interior is a battleground for what he feels to be two deadly hostile selves, one actual, the other ideal. As Victor Hugo makes his Mahomet say, something in French follows. Wrong living, impotent aspirations. What I would, that do I not, but what I hate, that I do, as St. Paul says. Self-loathing, self-despair, an unintelligible and intolerable burden to which one is mysteriously the heir. Let me quote from some typical cases of discordant personality, with melancholy in the form of self-condemnation and sense of sin. St. Augustine's case is a classic example. You all remember his half-pagan, half-Christian upbringing at Carthage, his emigration to Rome and Milan, his adoption of the Manichaeism and subsequent skepticism, and his restless search for truth and purity of life. And finally how, distracted by the struggle between the two souls in his breast, and ashamed of his own weakness of will, when so many others whom he knew and knew of had thrown off the shackles of sensuality and dedicated themselves to chastity and the higher life, he heard a voice in the garden say, "Take and read," and opening the Bible at random saw the text, "Not in chambering and wantonness, etc., which seemed directly sent to his address, and laid the inner storm to rest forever. Augustine's psychological genius has given an account of the trouble of having a divided self which has never been surpassed. Quote, "The new will which I began to have was not yet strong enough to overcome that other will, strengthened by long indulgence. So these two wills, one old, one new, one carnal, the other spiritual, contended with each other and disturbed my soul. I understood by my own experience what I had read. Flesh lusteth against spirit, and spirit against flesh. It was myself indeed in both the wills, yet more myself in that which I approved in myself than in that which I disapproved in myself. Yet it was through myself that habit had attained so fierce a mastery over me, because I had willingly come whither I willed not. Still bound to earth, I refused, O God, to fight on thy side, as much afraid to be freed from all bonds as I ought to have feared being trammeled by them. Thus, the thoughts by which I meditated upon thee were like the efforts of one who would awake, but being overpowered with sleepiness is soon asleep again. Often does a man, when heavy sleepiness is on his limbs, defer to shake it off, and though not approving it, encourage it. Even so, I was sure it was better to surrender to thy love than to yield to my own lusts, yet though the former course convinced me, the latter pleased and held me bound. There was naught in me to answer thy call, awake, thou sleeper, but only drawling, drowsy words, presently, yes, presently, wait a little while. But presently had no present, and the little while grew long. For I was afraid thou wouldst hear me too soon, and heal me at once of my disease of lust, which I wish to satiate rather than to see extinguished. With what lashes of words did I not scourge my own soul? Yet it shrank back. It refused, though it had no excuse to offer. I said within myself, "Come, let it be done now." And as I said it, I was on the point of the resolve. I all but did it, yet I did not do it. And I made another effort, and almost succeeded, yet I did not reach it, and did not grasp it, hesitating to die to death, and live to life, and the evil to which I was so wanted held me more than the better life I had not tried. End quote. There could be no more perfect description of the divided will when the higher wishes lack just that last acuteness, that touch of explosive intensity, of dynamogenic quality, to use the slang of the psychologists, that enables them to burst their shell and make irruption efficaciously into life and quell the lower tendencies forever. In a later lecture, we shall have much to say about this higher excitability. To find another good description of the divided will in the autobiography of Henry Alline, the Nova Scotian evangelist, of whose melancholy I read a brief account in my last lecture. The poor youth's sins were, as you will see, of the most harmless order, yet they interfered with what proved to be his truest vocation, so they gave him great distress. Quote, I was now very moral in my life, but found no rest of conscience. I now began to be esteemed in young company, who knew nothing of my mind all this while, and their esteem began to be a snare to my soul, for I soon began to be fond of carnal mirth, though I still flattered myself that if I did not get drunk, nor curse, nor swear, there would be no sin in frolicking and carnal mirth, and I thought God would indulge young people with some, what I called a simple or civil, recreation. I still kept a round of duties, and would not suffer myself to run into any